Okay, so thanks for joining us. Thanks for braving the cold to be here. I know it's a little chilly out there. Real quick, I want to let you know our next brown bake is on February 26th, and we are proud to have Crystal Alegria from the Extreme History Project in Bozeman come join us, and she's going to talk on cemetery symbolism in conjunction with our exhibit. So hope to see a good portion of you there. But anyway, back to today. Today we welcome Bill Spath and Jim Murphy from the Rotary Club, the Rodeo Club, the Rotary Club, to present about polio and the current efforts to eradicate the disease. Their presentation will cover a brief history of polio, the severity of it, and how the fight against polio is currently going. And if you didn't see it on your way in, be sure to see it on the way out. They brought in an iron lung, and it's downstairs in the lobby, so that's incredible to see. So anyway, welcome Bill and Jim.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here. What we plan to do is a short encore to our presentation we did for World Polio Day back in October. So Rotary's been very involved with polio eradication worldwide, and every October World Polio Day gives us an opportunity to kind of update people on what's going on with respect to polio and try to raise some money for polio. So this is kind of revisiting that presentation, and Bill Spath and I are going to kind of tag team this, so we'll be switching back and forth. We want to be real informal, so if you have questions as we go along, just let us know, or we have time for questions at the end of it too. Just a little background. My name again is Jim Murphy. For 32 years I was with the State Health Department in Helena in communicable disease. I was an epidemiologist and then the bureau chief of that program, worked with a lot of these diseases. So it's something that really interested me in joining Rotary because of their role in things like this. And I'll let Bill say a little bit about his background and where he comes from.
Well, where I came from was St. Louis. I've been here for 35, 36 years, and I taught at Tech for 32 years in the Occupational Safety and Health Department, although we did have an applied health science degree, and most of our graduates went to PT school or PA school or go on to different kinds of advanced degrees or work in those areas. And for Rotary Club, I've been in the Rotary Club since 1986, and in the last 10 or 15 years, I've been the person who connects to Rotary International regarding what status polio is in right now. And I get a report every week from Rotary talking about that, and we're going to include some of that in the talk today. So we'll give that back to Jim.
So hopefully everybody will be able to hear me as I toggle through slides here, but what we're going to do is kind of cover a variety of topics, starting with Polio 101, very short little primer on polio, a little bit about what it is, how it impacts people. And then I'll hand it off to Bill to talk about Rotary's role and milestones in ending polio. And then it'll bounce back to me to talk about the Montana perspective a little bit, including a pretty in-depth write-up that was done by some coworkers of mine at the State Health Department about Montana's unique role in the polio vaccine trials in the 50s. A lot was done here in Montana, and it's a neat story to tell. I'll share some of that. And then we'll pass it back to Bill, talking about how you can help. So Polio 101. So polio is something that's been around for a long time with us. There's a little bit of history coming up on it, but the big thing to know is polio, or poliomyelitis, is the more formal name for it. It's a disabling and life-threatening disease. It's caused by a poliovirus, which is an enterovirus. Enterovirus is something that inhabits the enteric tract. That's where that word entero and enteric comes from. So if you look at something that can infect you by ingesting it into the mouth, it can actually infect those cells in your mouth and your throat, and then the cells in your gut and the cells in your intestines. So that's very important when you have to understand where it kind of sets up shop. It also impacts how it gets transmitted. It also gives us some ways to attack it in order to eradicate it. So polio can be spread through a few different ways. The most common way is contact with feces or poop from an infected person. It's considered a fecal-oral transmission route. And a lot of diseases, a lot of viruses are like this. Everybody hears about the cruise ship virus, norovirus. You see those cruise ships that get those big illnesses. That's a fecal-oral virus, the same as poliovirus is. Now this one also, because it inhabits those cells that line your throat and things, can also be kind of coughed up at people too. So that's why in a household, when you were a little kid in the 50s and somebody got polio, the other household contacts were at great risk of transmission from you. Even if your hygiene was great, there was a risk of transmission to those close contacts. And the other thing to know is people who are infected, most of them don't have any symptoms. And that's what makes polio kind of challenging. And you'll see some numbers here with the symptoms of infection. 1 out of 4 might have flu-like symptoms, sore throat, little nausea. You wouldn't even know it's polio, you wouldn't know it from anything else. Comes and goes, doesn't impact you any more than that. Most people won't even know they had polio virus infect them. The good thing is those people will be immune from that, and that really helps us out. Now 1 out of 25 will have a more serious condition called meningitis, where the virus crosses into the blood-brain area or the spinal column, and that can be life-threatening for some people, but most people recovered from that all right. And 1 out of 200, or less than 1%, will have those symptoms that we think about most often when you hear polio. The weakness, the paralysis, the deformed limbs, things like that. So if you see 1 case of paralysis, that means that there's probably about another 199 people out there that didn't show any signs or symptoms or had mild signs and symptoms. So 1 case of paralysis is kind of a bell going off saying that there's a lot of polio virus circulating in a community or a population. If you see that 1, it's kind of looking at the small tip of the iceberg. So someone that's infected can shed the virus for several weeks. That can be used to your advantage, but it also can be a disadvantage. We don't become carriers, fortunately, so you'll clear that infection. So all that's important when you look at ways to attack polio. So it's been around for a long time. This is a carving from about 3,500 years ago from Egypt, showing what clinicians believe is a deformed limb, very characteristic of polio. So you can see that it's been around for a long time. It was first medically described in the late 1700s by an English physician who was credited with the first detailed medical write-up of a case. Before that, these things would sporadically happen and people really didn't have a great way to explain it. He recognized a little bit more of a syndrome and put it on paper, and people started to understand what was going on a little bit better. Epidemics were first described in the US and in Europe in the 1800s as we became a little bit more sophisticated, tracking the illnesses in populations, kind of studying that stuff. We noticed these clusters of things. Now, polio infections in the United States peaked in the 50s with more than 21,000 paralytic cases in like 1952. And again, if you remember, if you have 21,000 paralytic cases, usually in infants or young kids, for every 1 of those cases, there's another 200 people out there that are probably, contracted the virus, didn't have major signs or symptoms, but they were also able to spread the virus to other people. So you can imagine the pool of people it takes to get 21,000 paralytic cases. Again, a lot of our disease stuff, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg when you look at the most severe numbers. Now, following the introduction of effective vaccines, which kind of began with the Salk injectable vaccine in 1955, the polio impact in the United States fell dramatically. 10 years after 1955, by 1965, there was a 95% reduction in the number of polio, just in 10 years. So dramatic impact of the vaccine when it first came online. Now, the last case of wild polio virus was acquired in the United States in 1979. And wild virus and vaccine-associated virus are terms that come up a lot when you talk about polio. And this is some of the controversy still around polio eradication that's currently going on. So wild virus is the natural occurring polio virus that we're trying to eradicate from the world. Vaccine-associated virus is a virus that is in the oral polio vaccine that is still used in some parts of the world. And unfortunately, if you give that vaccine to 2 million kids, on the average, about 1 kid will develop paralysis. And when you're vaccinating a couple billion doses, the numbers start to grow. So in some parts of the world right now, they're still using oral polio vaccine, which has that small risk of mutating in somebody's body and becoming a disease-causing organism again. So that is a drawback to the oral polio vaccine that is used in some parts of the world. Now, the reason they still use it is because it's very stable and it's easy to give kids a sugar cube. I remember getting a sugar cube down on Front Street when I was a kid here in the 70s. That's the oral polio vaccine. It's stable. You don't need a medical unit to come out and give you an injection, right? So you can imagine when you're trying to eradicate this in a war-torn country or a very poverty-stricken country, that's going to be an easy way to get some vaccine in people. The other thing that the oral polio vaccine will do is that weakened virus that's in there can be shed from the person that gets it. They'll shed it for a number of weeks. That's good in some ways because as they shed that, people that might be exposed to them as they shed that are actually kind of getting vaccinated too. So if you're vaccinating nomadic tribe of folks in Afghanistan, where we still have polio, you're getting a little bit more bang from your buck using the oral polio vaccine. But you have that small risk of causing paralysis in somebody that gets that. So it's a trade-off. Now they're trying to move to injectable polio vaccine. And in this country, we've used nothing but injectable vaccine for the last 25 years. So that's kind of a controversy among the people that are still trying to eradicate polio is where do you reach that cutoff and switch over? But that's why you see wild virus versus vaccine-associated virus sometimes in the information we have. Now, polio doesn't have to be with us in the future. There's a couple reasons that this could be eradicated. So there's only been one other disease that we've really eradicated. Anybody know what that one is? Smallpox, right? So smallpox was eradicated. This one is very close. And this one's a good candidate for a couple reasons. One is humans are the only reservoir for the polio virus. Other animals don't carry it. If you think about like rabies, for instance, skunks, bats, any mammal can have it. Eradicating something like rabies, probably not going to happen. But something that only inhabits humans, and we can give humans an effective and safe vaccine, you have a good chance of eradicating this. And we're very close to doing that. Sanitation plays a big role in this too, because we're excreting this virus. Those areas that improve their sanitation, how they handle human waste, they'll do a lot better than the places that don't have those resources. And the last thing is the decades of worldwide efforts are paying off. And Bill will talk a little bit about that, and you'll see how dramatic some of that is. So I'll turn it over to Bill to talk about Rotary's role.
Thank you, sir. We'll start with 1979 in terms of Rotary's getting involved in fighting polio. They projected to try and immunize 6 million children in the Philippines, and there's a relation to that and this next slide, because the president of Rotary International was from the Philippines, and he kind of decided that was his project for the year to immunize all the kids in the Philippines. And they went a long way to doing that, and their initial fundraising effort, you want to remember this number for later on, was they decided to try and raise $120 million to do that. And that's for Philippines. 88, they started with the World Health Organization to launch the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. And they estimated for quite a few years in this age range, 350,000 cases of polio occurred in 125 countries for several years. It was widespread. 94, the International Commission for the Certification of Polio Myelitis Eradication announced that polio was eliminated in the Americas. And that means North and South America, Central America, etc. And we haven't had a case, except for one instance, in all those years. And I don't know, it was 2 or 3 years ago, they had a family that went to either Afghanistan or Pakistan, were exposed to the virus, came back and developed polio. But everybody else has been immunized, correct? So it didn't go anywhere. So that was a plus. 1995, health workers and volunteers immunized 165 million children in China and India. You think that was a project? That was really amazing. Rotary launches the Polio Plus Partners Program, enabling Rotary members in polio-free countries to provide support for those people in polio-endemic countries in terms of inoculating those children. 2000, a record 550 million children, almost 10% of the world's population, received the polio virus vaccine. Western Pacific region, spanning from Australia to China, was also declared polio-free in that particular year by 2000. 2003, 6 countries remain in terms of being polio endemic. And some of these you probably think of that, yeah, okay, that's the case. Afghanistan, Egypt, India, Nigeria, Pakistan. What's the population of those countries? How many people, children, do they have who are being exposed all the time? And what are they doing about it? And how can you immunize every child in India with its population? But that has happened. 2006, the number left were Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And they had World Polio Immunization Days that just went in and immunized millions of children in those countries. And because some of these countries are sort of backwards in terms of not really having written languages or people who can verbally pass things along, what they did was, when they went in, immunized a child, they used some purple ink on a fingernail. And when they went back in a few days or a few months or whenever, they could still see that dye on the hand. They knew that person was now not going to get polio. And that's one of the things they did to help understand what's going on. Rotary's contribution by 2009, $800 million. Quite a bit. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation kicked in $355 million and issued Rotary a challenge of $200 million, resulting in the total being $555 million for a global eradication initiative. And Bill Gates, which we'll see a little bit from him in a minute, challenged Rotary that if you give $1, he will match it with $2. And that's been going on for at least 5 years. And he continues to give that support. 2011, they began a new public awareness campaign called the Ambassador Program and labeled it This Close. And when they say this close, they always hold up their fingers. We're this close. I lost the battery. Yep. There and there. I get excited. Okay. So they developed this program to help other people help them advertise the fact that they're fighting polio. And Desmond Tutu, Itzhak Perlman, the co-founder of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, and Angelique Kidjo, I think it's pronounced, Ziggy Marley, and Dr. Jane Goodall. So quite a few important people in terms of how popular they are with people and how many people know them. In 2012, endemic countries are now just 3. 2014, India and the Southeast Asia region certified polio-free by the World Health Organization. Polio cases down over 99% since 1988. Quite an amazing change. 2020, the World Health Organization certifies that African region wild polio free. The African region primarily at last was Nigeria, and they fought it there. If you go into an area and try and make it polio free, you have to immunize everybody, follow it for 3 years, and if there's no case for 3 years, they declare it polio free. And so that's what we're still fighting with the 2 last countries. Now that's kind of a map of the world in terms of what's going on with polio situations, and this was 1988. And remember, we said that North America was pretty much free at that point. 91, less in South America. Europe and Africa still pretty well covered with cases. 94, North America, South America, Central America, polio free. Africa, Europe, the Russian states, etc., still had cases. 97, decreasing significantly in that area of Europe, etc., Africa, and so on. 98, it's a little smaller than it was in the previous map, and there are certain areas in Africa that are polio free. Oops. 2000, smaller yet. 2003, quite a few less cases in the world. And this was when there was 4 countries that were still endemic. Now we have just a couple of areas, Nigeria being the one in Africa, and then Afghanistan, Pakistan. And 2020 to the present, we still have cases in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And for the reasons that Jim mentioned, poor sanitation, poor health care, wars, etc., it's very difficult to go in there and have every child immunized. and in part because sanitation is not great either. When they start blowing up things, etc. And a lot of sanitation was a ditch that ran down somewhere, and all the people eliminating waste, etc. in that ditch, and kids play in it, which they do. That happens. Okay, this is a, okay, go ahead. And that picture is Bill Gates.
For inviting me to share a few words today. And most importantly, thank you for your incredible partnership in the fight to eradicate polio. A century ago, around the same time Rotary was starting to grow into the global institution it is today, polio was one of the most feared diseases in the world. It bankrupted families, shut down entire cities, and put the President of the United States in a wheelchair. Today, we're close to ending it for good. When Rotary led the way to create the Global Polio Eradication Initiative in 1988, wild polio paralyzed 350,000 children every year. In 2023, that number was down to 12. More than 2.5 billion children have received polio vaccines worldwide, and at least 20 million of them who would have otherwise been paralyzed never had to experience the disease. The world has eradicated polio in hundreds of countries. In fact, 2024 marks the 10-year anniversary of a polio-free India, once considered to be the most challenging country to get polio cases to zero. So the finishing line is within sight. But crossing it won't be easy. Violent conflicts, climate disasters, and a global pandemic disrupted health systems around the world. We continue to see cases in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the only two countries where wild polio is still endemic. And unfortunately, we're still seeing variant polio cases in countries in Africa where the virus was previously eliminated. So, the tough fact is, as long as polio exists anywhere, it's a threat to spread back everywhere. This is our best chance to finish the job. And so these next 2 years are absolutely critical. To aid our efforts, we have fantastic new tools at our disposal, like what's called the new OPD2 vaccine that our foundation helped develop. And that produces fewer mutations and variants. That vaccine was actually rolled out in 2021 during the pandemic, and already more than 1 billion doses have been administered around the world, reducing the risk of new outbreaks by over 80% compared to the previous vaccine. But all the scientific progress in the world would be meaningless without people making sure that vaccines actually are reaching all the kids. The world owes a debt of gratitude to the Rotarians, healthcare workers and volunteers who've knocked on doors, set up clinics, and traveled across countries to make sure children are protected from this awful disease. The Gates Foundation is thrilled to continue our 2-to-1 giving match with Rotary, up to $50 million a year, tripling the impact of every dollar you raise. We're so grateful that Rotary has taken full advantage of that match during this critical period, and we hope to continue that streak in the years ahead. The role of Rotary goes far beyond fundraising, of course. Rotarians have been leading the charge on this issue since the beginning through advocacy, awareness campaigns, and direct service. We should all be incredibly proud of how far we've come. When polio is eradicated, and I do mean when, not if, it will be one of the biggest advances in public health in human history. The world would have never gotten to this point without Rotarians, and we won't be able to get over the finish line without all your efforts. I'm looking forward to celebrating with you the day we cross it together. So thank you once again for all that you do.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about that study that I mentioned, or I'm sorry, a paper that was published by some of my coworkers looking at Montana's role in the Salk vaccine trials. And for anybody that's interested in that article, it's 23 pages long, so it's not for the faint of heart. And it was too big to copy for everybody, but if you are interested in this, there's a sign-up sheet. If you put your email on there, I'd be happy to send it to you. But this was in the autumn 2019 issue of Montana Magazine. So I'm sure the archive probably has copies of Montana Magazine around, and libraries do, but autumn of 2019, this was in there. And we put a lot of real work into this, and it includes a lot of neat pictures. This one on the front of it, for instance, is a kid at Chaudière Hospital in Helena with braces on his legs and in a wheelchair because he was stricken with polio. And you have to remember, for every one kid you see like that, there's a couple hundred other people out there that were infected with the virus. But if you're interested in that article, would like a copy of it, throw your email on that sign-up sheet. We'd be happy to get it to you. So looking at a little bit of the history of this, we probably had cases that were unrecognized occurring in Montana for some time. Definitely in the US in the 1800s, there were cases of polio around. People didn't really recognize it for what it was, or it wasn't, in high enough numbers to get too much attention. As we got a little more sophisticated with disease tracking, like I mentioned earlier, it was easier to recognize clusters. Causes of illnesses were unknown when this first started happening, but later they recognized that person-to-person transmission was probably what was going on as we studied these things. And as you recognized, where the transmission was coming from around the 1900s, large cities in the eastern United States had outbreaks. And they had enough common sense to kind of study that they could see that this was something that was being transmitted from person to person, but there were probably other things going on too, and they weren't sure exactly what to do. So in New York in 1916, there was a large outbreak, and they decided that they would go the extra mile and be safe, so they tried to kill a lot of dogs and cats. Any wild guess in New York in 1916 how many cats they killed? 72,000. 8,000 dogs, 72,000 cats. So you can imagine the fear that drove those types of decisions, when you're not certain how people are getting this, and it seemed to be like a random lightning strike on children, because children were the ones that were showing up with paralysis. And it wasn't every kid in a family. It'd be like there's one kid in that family, the other kids probably had polio too, but they were those kids that didn't have any symptoms. So it had people really, really frightened. Word of this activity back east did come back to Montana. I mean, the trains were bringing, people back here. There was fear that the disease was going to be transmitted back here with Easterners coming to Montana. Telegraphs, things like that, were communicating what was going on back east to us. So the state was kind of looking at what was going on. Despite the limited understanding of what was going on back there, everybody was getting concerned nationwide because communication was starting to become nationwide with telegraphs. So our first case in Montana that was recognized was in 1908. So that was the first time that somebody said, this is a polio case. Shortly after, our legislature added polio to the list of reportable diseases. So this was something that they wanted to take serious. They added it to tuberculosis and whooping cough, or pertussis. Two things that are still with us. Polio, fortunately, not with us in our hemisphere. So we started to take it a little bit more serious. We wanted to track it. Everybody was afraid of what was going on back east, and that could, happen here. Now in 1916, it did happen here. That was the first outbreak in Montana. Billings area, the Crow Reservation, had the first outbreak. The average age of cases was 5 years of age. And again, that's because those were the people that were, most susceptible to this. A lot of the older people probably had some immunity to it. But those new kids on the block, those were the ones that, were going to be kind of the canary in the coal mine showing up saying that there's transmission occurring locally. A teenager in Hardin, Bighorn County, became the case or the state's first recognized fatality. And by the time this outbreak was over, 111 cases with 24 deaths. So pretty severe. And those deaths happened because of the paralysis and the breathing difficulties. So the way the polio virus works, if the polio virus gets into your body and it basically moves out of your GI tract, it can go into your blood and your spinal cord and impact the neurons that are communicating with your muscles. So if you think about this, I mean, our brain is sending these signals to control your muscle movement all the time. What polio does is it gets in there and it damages those motor neurons that do that transmit that signal. And that's why people ended up with paralyzed limbs. Sometimes it was just one arm, sometimes it was just one leg. Other times it was everything from the neck down and you couldn't breathe. And that's where the lungs come in, and you saw some pictures of those in the Bill Gates video. So people had different, impacts as far as severity if you had paralysis. Some people recovered from it. Some people never recovered from it, and in this case, 24 deaths in a fairly small area. And if you think back 100 years ago, fairly small population in that area. It wasn't 100,000 plus people like it is now. I mean, these weren't giant communities back then. To have 24 deaths in that area would be something really significant. So in 1917, we continued to have outbreaks of this. This sizable one in Great Falls had 12 cases with 2 deaths. They started to do restrictions on events, and marking of houses occurred. So restrictions on events should sound familiar to anybody that lived through COVID, right? I mean, these are standard practices. The marking of houses, we don't do that anymore. And that would be even more controversial than canceling somebody's basketball game. So we continue to experience this year after year in Montana, these sporadic numbers. You can see some of the outbreaks are listed here. 1920, Ravalli had 27 cases. 22, Yellowstone County outbreak with 42 cases, and experimental treatments with horse serum. And what's funny, the treatments with horse serum, the antibodies from the horse, is what they were trying to convey to the people. This just shows some recovery. It was helping some of the people that had the worst outcomes. So the horse serum therapies was something that they were experimenting with and showed some promise. But things continued like this. 1924 in Montana, 182 cases with 23 deaths occurring in 4 counties. So, again, this is 100 years ago. Our population was, 350,000 people, and you had these kinds of impacts. So this is kind of how things went. I mean, it was kind of like, maybe we'll have a summer without polio, maybe we'll have another outbreak. Nobody really knew what was going on and what would happen, and this was kind of how it went on for decades. Now, if you look at this is kind of a telling history of how the numbers looked in Montana, and you'll see some stops and starts. So the green line represents, how high the number count got that year. The black are reported polio deaths. And you can kind of see that if you get a peak, like in 28 or so, we had kind of a high number, and you had a high number of deaths. 1932 is a bad year, highest number we ever had. But if you look at the 50s, this was our worst time, because it was year after year the numbers were high. So this is just kind of how things went, and people just kind of accepted this. But in the background, there were people like Salk, and Sabin, and others working on vaccines to try to do something about this. So let's just soak that in for a minute there. You can see some of the highlights. You see our last case, I believe, was 71, was the last case in Montana. It's interesting, we still have people suffering from polio even today in Montana. I remember once I was looking at a vital statistics report at work, and this was like 2010, I was reading this report, and it said, in 2009 we had 3 polio deaths in Montana. And I thought, what? Didn't you hear about these? What's going on? So I pulled the death certificates at work, and these were people in their 80s that died, and on the death certificate it listed death from whatever, and then it said underlying cause was post-polio syndrome. So these were those lifelong debilitating conditions that, contributed to their death, and the doctor thought it was probably contributing to an earlier death. So we still see people that are, surviving from polio. Almost everybody we talk to knows somebody or had a relative that had a limp or a limb that was impacted by this. It was a real thing. So more with the Montana perspective, throughout the 20s and 40s, they were trying to do a lot of different things. They recognized that transmission and sanitation went hand in hand, and there were things that were popping up even before we had vaccines. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, started the first group. It was the National Foundation for Infant Paralysis, which led to the March of Dimes. Everybody heard that term? That was started in 1937. In 1939, Montana had its first chapters of the NFIP. So this was something that was going on nationwide, and the population was pretty invested in it because fear was high. Now the worst outbreak was in the 50s, and that was a US outbreak. That was also our worst year, with over 800 cases in 3 years documented in Montana. So that early 50s period was pretty frightening, and that was still pre-vaccine, where you couldn't do much about it except worry about what was going to happen. Now this is the time when Salk wanted to test his vaccine, and they identified 4 counties in Montana to enroll in what would be the largest study ever done in the United States of any medical product that we had seen so far. So Mineral, Missoula, Park, and Gallatin counties participated in a nationwide trial that involved almost 500,000 children. So pretty large effort. Now in those 4 counties we had participate, 75% of the kids that were eligible by age participated. So 3/4 of the kids participated, which is a tremendous participation rate in anything. I mean, these days if we wanted to do a new vaccine trial, I think we'd be lucky to get like 20% of the kids because of vaccine hesitancy and fear and things like that. But everybody was pretty invested in this because everybody was motivated. So very high participation rate. So some things that popped up, looking at the study that they did, despite the vaccine trials, safety and production concerns slowed widespread adoption. So one of the early things that scared people with vaccine was an incident called the Cutter incident in 1955, where one of the, it was Cutter Laboratories, one of the vaccine stocks that were being used didn't go through proper treatment and didn't get deactivated and caused even more severe illness in some of the people that received it. That kind of knocked this effort back a couple steps when it happened. It also led to kind of the rise of the oral polio vaccine in this country, which some people perceived would be more safe, despite some of the drawbacks of the oral polio vaccine. So, it's not all just, a equal road in public health to kind of, make progress here. There's always going to be setbacks. What you want to do is try to keep moving forward and make sure that the setbacks are fewer than what was going to happen if you weren't doing something. And I think polio is a good example of that. Now, between 1913 and 1971, those are kind of the bookends in our polio activity in Montana, from our earliest reportable cases when they passed the law to our last case. About 3,000 cases were logged, and these were the more severe cases. These were the paralysis cases. So again, that means that there was a lot more of this out there floating around in the communities. And 317 deaths in Montana were recognized during that time frame. Now by 1964, and again, this is just about 10 years after the introduction of the first vaccine and a few years after the oral polio vaccine, 73% of Montana's children were recognized to be vaccinated. So pretty high uptake rate, so 3 out of 4. 77% of those 5 to 14 were vaccinated, and 63% of those 15 to 39 were fully vaccinated. So over a short time frame, just 10 years after the introduction of vaccine, we're well on our way to having about 2/3 of the population at risk vaccinated. Today, we're doing pretty good on this number. We're still a little bit behind the national average in Montana on most of the vaccines, but about 93% of our kindergartners are fully vaccinated for polio. That means they have 4 doses, sometimes 5 doses, depending on the product they received on board. So big effort still goes into this. And as Bill Gates mentioned in his, his snippet there, was that as long as polio is still someplace in the world, we're at risk of not vaccinating, and we're at risk of transmission. So a good case in point is a couple years ago there was a 20-something old guy in New York that became a case of polio. And he hadn't really been anywhere other than a party about 8 days prior to his onset of illness. So he wasn't an international traveler or anything like that. But someone who was a traveler had brought this virus back into their community. And because this 20-something-year-old was unvaccinated, he was susceptible to it. When they looked at his case and they kind of do genetic fingerprinting on the virus, they found that virus in the wastewater in their community and surrounding communities. So there was a lot of virus that was, again, the vaccine-derived virus, not the wild virus, but the vaccine-derived virus floating around in their community. That guy was unlucky enough to come across that. And because he wasn't protected, he was able to become a case of paralysis. So he had mild paralysis, spent a couple weeks in the hospital, went into a rehab place, never saw many updates on him after that. But they matched that strain that was floating around in their sewage systems with strains in Jerusalem and London, England. So this is the kind of CSI genetic matching that they can do. But that's the drawback again of that oral polio vaccine, throwing those strains out there. If you're all vaccinated and you run into that, you're safe. But if you're not vaccinated and you run into that strain, it can cause disease. So we still see people at risk. So I'll turn it back over to Bill, and then we will have time for questions or any discussion at the end too.
Thanks, Jim. How we can all help. If we just spread the information to people who don't hear these kinds of presentations, you can make them aware of what's going on in the world with polio at this date. Also, anytime you donate through Rotary International, if you go to the Rotary International website, you can donate money to them, and then Bill Gates will match it 2-to-1 to help immunize, create the vaccines, spread the use of those vaccines, and send it to countries that are in the most poor shape for vaccinations. So that is very, very important. And if you looked at the Iron Lung downstairs, if you haven't yet, take a look at it when you leave. There is a couple of signs that we had made for World Polio Days a couple of years ago. October 24th every year is World Polio Day, and you can make donations through them. And in a minute, we're going to get to a slide that actually has a QR code that if you took a picture of that with your phone, it will get you to the site that you can donate through that way. Or just go to the Rotary International website, which is rotary.org. Okay? Now, you probably can't read that too well from where you are, but number 1 says polio mainly affects children under the age of 5. Second, there is no cure, but polio can be prevented with a vaccine. 3, only 2 countries remain endemic, and you've heard that over and over today already, Afghanistan and Pakistan. 4, we've reduced cases by 99.9% since '88. And it's that program where we say we're this close. And 5, until we end polio forever, every child is at risk. And that's something you want to keep in mind for your families, your grandkids, etc. Okay? So your donation to Rotary will help the Rotary and Rotary partners reach every child with a polio vaccine. And together, everybody in this room and everybody across the world can end polio. And if you want to take a picture of that QR code, we can do that at the end here, and we'll leave it up. And I think that's the last. Oh, there's a couple more here. And this is another short presentation.
Many people today wouldn't recognize what this is. And that's an amazing thing because it shows how much progress we've made against polio. It's a terrible disease, and in most countries now, largely forgotten. The paralysis from polio starts with your legs and then can get up into this diaphragm area. And so a lot of people die simply because they can't breathe, and that's where this comes in to help out. This is called an arm lung. It's a mechanical respirator. There's a pump down here that creates enough air pressure that even though your diaphragm is paralyzed, it allows you to keep breathing. So your head sticking out here, it's pretty grim, but it used to keep thousands of people alive. The the height of the polio epidemic in the United States was in the 1940s and 50s. This used to be something that you could see rows and rows of, and lots of hospitals, kids lying in here, and then that pump actually allowing them to breathe. The reason we don't have kids needing these anymore is because of the polio vaccine. We've reduced the number of cases by 99.9%. And now wild polio is only in 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. During this pandemic, the world benefited from the precious resource of the polio program, where all that personnel shifted their focus to help contain the spread of COVID-19. As much as we've achieved in the polio fight, I can't think of a more important time for us to double down and finish the job. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative has a great plan that will do more than just eradicate polio, but will also raise vaccination rates and improve health very dramatically. This arm lung was a great tool, but now we need the arm will of everybody involved in this fight. And it's thanks to the commitment of Rotary and many other partners that makes me confident we can create a world where no child will ever be paralyzed by polio again.
Maybe you're not familiar with iron lungs at all, but that diaphragm moving back and forth can increase the pressure inside the iron lung and reduce the pressure inside the iron lung. And it doesn't have to be more than 3 or 4 psi. It doesn't have to be a lot. And if it increases the pressure inside the iron lung, it forces air out of your lungs. And if you decrease the pressure inside the air lung around the body, it causes more air to move into the lungs. So that's how it did work at the time. I'm going to go back to this one. If you want to take a picture of that QR code, please feel free. And I'll leave Jim do the final discussion. Thanks. Questions?
So that's essentially ends the show that we've got for you.
I forgot this.
Okay. Oh, Bill's got an update here with some numbers.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this. In 2020, there were 140 cases in the world and in endemic countries. In 2021, there were 6 cases globally and 5 in the endemic countries. In 2022, there were 30 global cases and 22 in the 2 endemic countries. In 2023, there were 12 cases globally and they were in the endemic countries. Unfortunately, in 2024, with the things that are going on in the world, globally, there were 98 cases of polio, and they were in the 2 endemic countries. Sorry.
So if we want to open it to any questions or comments that people may have, we'd be happy to talk or clarify anything that we mentioned.
First of all, thank you for the work that the Rotary Club did. All the service clubs, Kiwanis Alliance, they all do a great job there. Thank you. I'm wondering how you're going to combat the rumors that are going around about vaccines and so forth, and especially with our current government seeming to dismantle all the safety systems that are out there. Yeah, so what work are you putting into?
Yes. So the question was about, how do you combat some of the misinformation or concerns about vaccine? And this is something that, we worked with, year after year when I was at the state health department. One of the programs that I was responsible for in my bureau was the state immunization program. And we were dealing with vaccine hesitancy back in 1990. And if anything, it's gotten much, much worse with the arrival of social media and how quickly, information can spread. What's funny is when we looked at the history of vaccine hesitancy, you remember the stories about Jenner. He's the one that pretty much figured out, hey, there's ways to vaccinate using something called cowpox. And these were the first vaccines against smallpox, right? So he figured out that these milkmaids were basically not getting smallpox. They were getting something similar from their contact with cows, and they were protected. That's what kind of led, at least in the Western world, to the brainchild of immunizations. As soon as Jenner was doing this stuff, anti-vaccine stuff came out. I mean, there were people that were doing political cartoons back then about people turning into cows. So this is something that, goes back as long as vaccines go back. Unfortunately, it just is something that, gets a little bit more traction. Like, Mark Twain talked about, the a rumor or a lie can go around the world before the truth even gets its boots on. That's how it seems when you're combating vaccine misinformation. And it's really something that we struggle with. I mean, the Center for Disease Control was our guide for how we dealt with this in Montana. We tried to do campaigns, we tried to educate people, we tried to get doctors talking to the legislature so that they would make good informed decisions. So far, none of that has worked very well. The best thing that we found that would work is talking to clinicians and having clinicians talk to their patients. If you have that one-on-one relationship with your clinician and your clinician is endorsing the vaccine, that seemed to get most parents over the vaccine hesitancy hump. But there's other people that, just won't have that at all. And right now, it's going to be something we really struggle with as we, recover from COVID and all the negative press from COVID and move into the realm where, we don't really need these vaccines anymore. These diseases are gone. We end up with complacency in our population, and that's kind of our worst enemy. It's a shame to have to see something, come back in order for us to take that vaccine serious. I think one great example right now is with the advent of RFK possibly being the Director of Health and Human Services, and I won't say yay or nay on that, you probably already know what I think, but they looked at what happened in Samoa with measles, and you would have heard a little bit about this. Well, in 2019, there was a couple nurses that made a terrible mistake mixing up some vaccines in Samoa, which is Samoa the country, not American Samoa, our territory. Well, these nurses mixed up a couple vaccines. They mixed it with the wrong stuff and a couple kids died. This led to understandable concern about vaccines, but it led to a collapse of measles vaccination in that country. It went from like 77% down to 34% in like a few years. So this was 2019. Since that time, they have not recovered. And RFK made his visit around 2019 to help the situation, which didn't help. So where they are now is this population in Samoa of just over like 200,000, I think it is, has had over 5,700 cases of measles. And for those people that think measles, it's a childhood disease, you get it, you get immune, no sweat. 83 deaths, almost all of them in kids under 4. I mean, it doesn't take much to get these things to come back. The other thing that we used to point towards was in the mid-90s, after the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Union collapsed, those countries that had high vaccination rates because of the socialized, nationalized medical system that they had, those countries were on their own after that. They saw things like diphtheria come back in the mid-90s that they never experienced before. So, I mean, it's kind of nice to think that you'll get to a point where you can not have to vaccinate anymore, but besides smallpox, we're really not there. Smallpox, we did quit vaccinating for because there's not enough, smallpox to justify it. We don't vaccinate for tuberculosis in this country. Some countries do. So it's a matter of trust with the health officials. It's a matter of trust with the health providers to try to, understand that they're recommending things that are still in the greater community good. And, trying to get people convinced of that seems to be a real struggle these days, especially when leadership kind of takes a, non-committal position on it. So I don't know if that's much of an answer, and I apologize for the soapbox, but it's something we struggle with. And, we're seeing increases in pertussis in Montana right now, and we're seeing less uptake of the pertussis vaccine. We always do pretty lousy for flu vaccine in Montana. Fewer than, I think we're right, a little under half the adults that are eligible for flu vaccine even get it. And it can keep you out of the hospital, it can keep you out of the grave. It might not keep you from getting a mild case of flu, but it can prevent the worst case scenarios. It can also prevent you from getting it and giving it to somebody else that maybe isn't as lucky or as healthy as you are. Those are the things that we try to get people to understand and change their minds, but a little bit difficult in today's climate. Sorry for the soapbox.
Thank you for your argument. It's all true.
Other questions or comments for either Bill or myself?
I just wondered, when I was a kid, there was polio scares in the 50s and stuff, and we lived a lot, but I remember you couldn't go out or go to swimming pools or anything. Is it true that it was more transmissible in the summer?
Yeah, so it's a good comment. I mean, this was something that, because we were excreting it and things like that, you know, if you had swimming holes, I mean, that's what FDR, you know, believes he acquired it, you know, through swimming, and it was kind of the mantra, like stay out of swimming pools and you know, stay out of swimming holes. It's a virus that people excrete, and unfortunately, you know, that lingers in those settings. You know, in fresh water, this can last for a week. In sewage contaminated water, it can last for several weeks. So people that come into contact with that are at risk. So that was one of the measures that they were trying to take.
The comment about swimming pools is something I remember from my childhood, because I was from St. Louis, and every summer my mother would take my brother and I out to the big swimming pools in the county area, which, you know, you could have several hundred people could be there in one day. And a swimming pool is, how actually sanitized is it? It's a problem. And my mother, at one point, I don't remember what year that was, quit taking us because of that scare of polio in those environments.
That's what we, us too, yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments for either of us? Sure.
For those that have polio as children, is there research on the repercussions of that now that they're older, as far as something happening to their physical?
Yeah, as far as I've been able to tell, most of the people that got polio didn't really have any signs or symptoms at the time. They'll get immunity and really have no long-term, you know, negative outcome from that. That smaller percentage that had muscle weakness or limb weakness or paralysis, those are the folks that, you know, can have problems later in life, and like those deaths I mentioned with post-polio syndrome, you know, contributing to some of their, you know, problems later in life. But the vast majority of people didn't seem to really have any ill effects if they were, you know, in that lucky group that really didn't show much. But, you know, that smaller percentage, you know, and it's a pretty small percentage, it's a couple percent. Those are the people that suffered from post-polio syndrome later on down the road and that. But you have to remember, it's a small percent, but when you're infecting just about everybody with something pretty contagious, you know, that small percent adds up. But yeah, I mean, definitely there's people that still suffer from post-polio syndrome type, you know, things later in life, and, you know, we still see doctors put it on death certificates.
I'm just wondering, if the World Health Organization is deleted, is there anything, any little tickles out there? Anybody have any idea what could replace that?
Well, question about the World Health Organization. I think the World Health Organization will still be around.
But not in this
Not
country.
here.
Yeah, just with the U.S., which is one of its major players, you know, withdrawing from it. Most of the stuff I've looked at from some of the public health community, and I'm still plugged into the public health community. I'm the health officer for Jefferson County where I live. Most of them see China stepping in, because China has the resources. And remember, this country used to talk about winning the hearts and minds. This is how you win the hearts and minds, is through these humanitarian efforts. So, you know, they think that, you know, other countries will step in and fill those gaps that are left by our country, you know, withdrawing from this. It puts our country in a difficult position for the next pandemic. I mean, we relied a lot on the World Health Organization for some of the information coming out of China in the early days of, you know, COVID. So, you know, how that's going to penalize us down the line, I don't know. I think these other countries will be magnanimous enough to still, you know, give us information and welcome us back because of the relationships our academics have with them. But having this country pull out its resources is, you know, really a short-sighted thing. Hard to figure out where the upside is on that.
Yes, I had polio in 1949 for the Salk vaccine, and I'm doing pretty good. But interesting thing about it, my mother said when I got polio, this was in a little town of 80 people in South Dakota, all the other mothers accused my mother of keeping her house too clean, which she didn't.
Yeah, so you know, there's some logic to that, you know, believe it or not. You know, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, even during COVID when we were keeping kids out of school and keeping kids out of daycare in some cases and that stuff, they don't get some of the childhood exposures or some of the childhood diseases that, we expect them to get and then build immunity from. It kind of delays that, and then it kind of hits us like a semi-truck all at once. So there's something to be said, for being out there, being exposed to things, because we do pick up our immunity that way. And people that, try to be extra clean and all that stuff, I mean, there is some evidence that just delays, these illnesses. And some of these illnesses, if you're a kid and you get chicken pox, you'll probably do all right. If you're an adult and you get chicken pox, it's going to be pretty bad. I mean, so some of these childhood diseases are much easier to get over with when you're a child and your system is still developing. So there was a little bit of logic to what they were saying there. I mean, you probably, would have had the same outcome either way.
What I wonder about, I never got an answer, if the other mothers let their kids play with.
Well, we've had some experience in Montana with, I don't remember a measles party ever, because we haven't had a measles case in Montana for decades. How we've escaped it is beyond me. But we did have, in my time, people doing chicken pox parties to expose their kids to chicken pox to get it over with, instead of going for the vaccine. So, different people take different approaches to it. None that we would recommend.
Yeah, I was gonna ask with, in recent years with the influx of a lot of new people to Montana, if we were seeing vaccine hesitancy, and if we, like maybe we're gonna, we're having some like measles cases or, things like that, or has there not been any?
Oh yeah, there's been an influx. I mean, one of the fun things that I used to have to do is deal with the legislature, in my position. And we always had anti-vaccine bills, but the effort behind those is much more organized, and I think social media helps with that. And a lot of people that have come to Montana came to Montana for the freedoms, and it's like, well, there's freedoms and then there's freedoms, right? But we do see a lot more organization in the anti-vax crowd, just like we saw, I don't know what you feel about raw milk too, but that was one of the things we dealt with too. Raw milk is a thing now in Montana, it's legal, never used to be. Vaccine exemptions have been eased a ton. We always had people that could exempt out of vaccine. We never held people down and vaccinated them. They had religious exemptions, philosophical exemptions, medical exemptions. Now, one and done. Mom can just say, I've got an objection to this, and the school has to honor that for the rest of that kid's life. Before, we used to say, which vaccine do you have an objection to? And, kind of talk a little bit the validity of that. All that's gone by the wayside because of recent legislative efforts. So, and a lot of this is influenced by, folks coming here for their freedoms. And we see them at the legislature. Haven't had to deal with that in the last few years since I left, retired, which is good, but it's much more organized. And, the level of misinformation is so heavy. We used to be able to respond to some of it. Now, most of the health departments have just given up on that. They're like, we can't battle it. You'd spend all your time trying to correct every record out there. What you try to do is tell people where they can find the reputable information, and then cross your fingers that they'll go there.
I was amazed at how much they traced measles. In 2018, we were at a wedding in Oregon, and there was a family there from New Zealand that had been to Indonesia and then came to the wedding in Oregon, and the 12-year-old girl got sick. And later, they diagnosed her with measles, and they had to contact every single person that was at that wedding and call them. And they called us and said, oh, you're over 50, you're fine, But do they still trace everything that closely?
Yeah, and we've had a lot of scares in Montana where we basically thought we were going to have measles, and we'd go through, okay, let's be prepared if the test comes back positive, what's everything downstream look like? And yeah, I mean, we basically start collecting all that information, trying to figure out, okay, if this pops up positive at the state lab, what's that downstream look like? Measles is one of the most contagious things we know. Unlike, they're talking about COVID probably does have an airborne or an aerosol route more than we thought early on, where we thought it was more limited to droplet, but nothing like measles. Measles is well documented that, if somebody in this room had measles, and we all leave, 2 hours later, somebody comes in and they're susceptible, they're probably going to get measles. I mean, it hangs out that long. So somebody walking through the airport that is contagious with measles, everybody in that airport corridor that they passed would be potentially exposed to it. And our notification would be like, if you were in, the A wing of the Salt Lake Airport from this time to this time, and you have any doubts about your vaccination status or your immunity status, we recommend you talk to your doctor, because we can't get everybody's name, right? So, but wedding parties, groups like that, yeah, we would try to get that and have that ready to go. We just dodged the bullet every time. We had people that had nice exposures and susceptible people that, somehow lucked out. But every year we dealt with a handful of those. But yeah, it's a big ordeal. And, again, measles is going to be one of those things that if it happens here, I mean, like Texas has an outbreak going on right now, and we've had outbreaks in the Dakotas in the last few years, we'll deal with it here. But if it gets carried away in the wrong population, then you can see what happens in Samoa. I mean, 83 deaths in Samoa from a disease that shouldn't be killing anybody anymore. That's the unfortunate thing. I mean, some of these diseases are just a plane ride away, they always say, and there's a lot of them in the news right now. There's tuberculosis in Kansas with one of the largest outbreaks that the U.S. has experienced, and I haven't seen a good write-up on where the hell did that come from. So there's a lot of these things going on. We're dealing with pertussis in Montana, flu, and COVID right now, and hopefully that will be it.
I apologize for stepping out. I don't know if you said the statistic that caught my eye last time, that polio was the third one reportable disease here in Montana. And how many did it grow that you are reportable here in Montana? How many different diseases?
Yeah, so the list of reportable conditions in Montana that are mandated to be reported to your local health department, and then reports them to the state, and so on. I think it's right now around about 90 conditions on there. Some of them are obscure things you never heard of, but any big ones you've heard of, TB, whooping cough, pertussis, all those, they're on there. But a lot of them now are obscure hospital-based infections, like some weird, bacteria that you probably only run across in a hospital if somebody messes up. So we've started to focus in on hospital infections now, as well as community infections. But it's a long list. It's getting up there nearly to 100. And we very seldom take anything off. We took chickenpox off. It was one of the first things I did in one of the programs I was in. We took chickenpox off the list at the recommendation of our healthcare provider because the vaccine was so effective, we weren't seeing it. And then 9/11 happened, and they were worried about smallpox, and they were worried about smallpox getting confused with chickenpox, and they made us put it back on. So, even when you take something off, you put it back on. Smallpox is still on our list, even though it's eradicated. So it's hard to get something off that list, it turns out. All right, well, thank you very much.